Film has emerged as one of the most popular and influential forms of communication technology in the world today. It first gained popularity in the late 19th century between 1892 and 1894 and has since become a multi-billion dollar industry. With the advent of streaming services, independent and low-budget films have found new audiences, and the industry continues to grow. In this presentation, we'll examine the significance of film in the Philippines during the 20th century, as well as its broader cultural, historical, individual, and political context and influence on a global scale. We will explore the evolution of film technology from still photography to aerial footage captured by drones, and the development of cameras from single-shot devices to high-quality productions that can be recorded on cellular devices. We'll also look at the process of film editing and post-production, as well as advancements in film animation. Additionally, we'll discuss the evolution of promotion and distribution, as well as how audiences consume films today.
Early 20th century in the Philippines was a tumultuous time for a culture of people transitioning from Spanish colonial rule to being a territory of the United States. The Philippines had been a colony of Spain for over 300 years. Spanish colonialism was ruthless, and any spark of indigenous Filipino culture, such as the spoken vernacular Tagalog, was quashed by the colonial power. Filipino resistance to brutal Spanish colonialism had been brewing long into the 19th century, and by the late 1880s and early 1890s, the Filipino resistance movement was growing in strength. By 1896, a full-on revolt against the Spanish was underway and lasted until the end of 1898. In April of 1898, a war between Spain and the United States over the Cuban independence movement began. The Spanish-American War, as it came to be known, ended by December of that same year. It resulted in Cuba's independence and Spain ceding territorial concessions to the United States, which included a deal for the U.S. to purchase the Philippines from Spain for $20 million. José Nepomuceno was born in 1893 and was just a child at the conclusion of the Spanish-American War when the Philippines became a United States territory. Nepomuceno grew up at a time when the Philippines was rediscovering its cultural identity after 300 years of colonial oppression. This reemergence of the Filipino identity was prevalent throughout the formative years of Nepomuceno's life. José Nepomuceno found inspiration for his films in popular zarzuelas, Spanish stage dramas that were a popular form of entertainment for the elite ilustrados in Manila and other urban centers around the turn of the century. Zarzuelas were a form of royal entertainment in Spain that came to the Philippines in the early 19th century. They were based upon romance, myth, legend, and religion for an audience made up of wealthy and elite patrons and performed in Spanish. Smaller indigenous cultural centers would often perform popular zarzuelas translated into the native vernacular known as Tagalog. Nepomuceno was influenced by the Moro Moro as well, an older form of Spanish religious drama that was introduced in the 17th century, then appropriated by the indigenous Filipino people who removed the religious themes and performed them in Tagalog in village centers as well. The juxtaposition of the zarzuela and the Moro Moro paints a picture of the competing forces of urban colonialism and indigenous rurality. Nepomuceno began making films during the decline of Filipino theater. The theater in the Philippines was in Spanish and Tagalog. The growing Americanization of the Philippines during the early 20th century saw a reduction in Spanish language entertainment and the expanding use of the English language. Without Spanish colonial rule, however, Filipinos were eager to express their cultural identities once again. Nepomuceno became the pioneering embodiment of this collective desire by revisiting popular zarzuelas as Filipino film by representing his stories in Tagalog. His films were shown across the Philippine Islands, and they quickly grew in popularity, helping fuel the development of new Filipino identity. This new national identity was formed in a collective consciousness that Nepomuceno helped to cultivate by representing Tagalog culture in his films rather than the cultures of the colonizers that occupied the space, both Spanish then American, as was the norm Nepomuceno helped to reinvent. José Nepomuceno created films in Tagalog from 1919 when his first film titled in Tagalog was released and among one of only 2 films with a Tagalog title in a 3-year period, to the early 1930s when over 13 films with Tagalog titles were released in a 3-year period. Nepomuceno's films are viewed by historians as being the main driving force behind the collective paradigm shift in the social culture of the Philippines in the early 20th century. The films encouraged Filipinos to embrace their indigenous identities and spoken languages, and revived their culture that had been oppressed by colonial forces for centuries, allowing Tagalog to become an official language of the people after 100 years of oppression. Without Nepomuceno's films, the spread of Tagalog culture might not have been as strong or as prevalent as it was in the early 20th century.
Cultural context. One of the few publications solely focused on culture, the monthly Cultura Social, mostly covered writing, music, and visual arts. The periodical often featured a section on movies called Endorsed Motion Pictures, which identified mostly American movies that the Catholic organization thought people should watch. The article occasionally emphasizes the value of film regulation in preserving children's innocence and defending social decency. Contrarily, Graphic argued that it was more crucial to regulate theater performances because Filipinos look upon life portrayed in the movies as foreign and incur very little danger of being corrupted by lurid, suggestive movie themes and scenes. More copies of motion picture and photoplay are sold in bookstores and newsstands than Noli Me Tangere, Les Miserables, or the works of Byron and Shakespeare, according to a 1922 editorial in The Independent that discussed the intellectual degeneracy of young people. It is possible to infer three things from the use of motion picture and photoplay. First, American magazines were imported and widely read. Second, young people's interest in movies was steadily increasing. And third, film magazines were perceived as being light, frivolous, and degenerate. Historical context. Historical context continued. Historical context continued. Historical context continued. Political context. Political context continued. Political context continued. Political context continued. Political context continued. Individual context continued. The most well-known photographic shop in Manila was founded in 1915 by Nepomuceno and his brother Jesus. This was the first step towards establishing a film studio, Millennium Movies, 1917, and creating the first Filipino film, Talagang Boskid, Country Maiden, 1919, which was based on a well-known zarzuela of the period. Additionally, he was accepted as a correspondent by Pathé and Paramount News, and his newsreels were broadcast internationally. José Nepomuceno is recognized as the pioneer of Philippine cinema today, despite the fact that nothing is known about him or his works. Since literacy in the Philippines was not widespread, José Nepomuceno's films accomplished what the great Filipino novels could not. Historical context continued. Here's a list of before and afters filming. Before, in 1909, aerial photographs were taken using an aircraft-mounted camera. The camera was so hefty that it was actually heavier than the aircraft. Because audiences could see the boundaries of the sets and props, the watching experience was so unreal. Filming continued after. Drones employ algorithms that take into account aspects of filmmaking such as shot sizes, viewing angles, and screen placement to get the ideal shot. Props and sets now come in greater quality and resolution, are scalable, have quick turnaround times, and are simple to customize thanks to 3D printing. Because they genuinely exist in physical space, unlike CGI, 3D printed objects interact with actors and actresses in a realistic way. Cameras before. Multiple takes of a sequence required using a lot of film, which was expensive while using film cameras. Reloading film cameras was a common requirement. A single scratch may completely spoil a scene because film is such a fragile medium. Without any visual aids, directors used to give actors and actresses criticism on their performance and suggestion on how they may do better. Cameras continued after. On the same shot, multiple digital cameras can be used to capture different viewpoints of a scene simultaneously. There is always a chance to get numerous takes. DSLRs, or digital single lens reflex cameras, have grabbed the lead. They enable high definition movie filming, which produces amazing picture quality. Actors and actresses can assemble around digital back cameras to view the recently filmed scene while noting what they can do better. Editing or post production before. All films underwent their original editing by physically cutting and pasting together bits of film, employing a splicer and threading the film on a device with a viewer. Editing or post production continued after. Filmmakers may now collaborate with global production teams thanks to the cloud. The ability to exchange and manage files amongst several project groups has made cooperation simpler. With the use of sophisticated editing tools, it is possible to produce the effects of an imaginary world and smoothly integrate them with digital camera video. Animation before. In order to cut down on the amount of frames and production times, characters were produced on cells and overlaid over popular backdrop photos. The lifelike effects were produced by artists using non-stop animation that was hand drawn. All animated cells were digitally inked and colored, eliminating the need for manual coloring in conjunction with the hand-drawn animation. Animation continued after. Almost all animated content is produced digitally using computers, digital pens, tablets, and sculpting software. Faster computers and the internet have made it feasible for one individual or a small staff to accomplish tasks that when 20 years ago could only be completed by huge studios. Studio outfit performers in mocap suits capture their motion in a method that corresponds with the character they're animating and store the motion as a skeleton animation that can be later connected to a model. Promotion or distribution before. Prior to the widespread usage of the internet, movie companies had no other way to advertise their future motion pictures except through billboards, posters, magazine adverts, and newspaper articles. A new sci-fi movie may have required extensive market research 20 years ago to establish where and when to release it. Promotion or distribution continued after. Self-distribution platforms design internet marketing strategies that may distribute material around the globe. On specialized websites that only focus on advertising, the most recent promotional content for the film business is collected. The material has additional features which provides websites users with a better user experience and more engaged participation. A certain audience with comparable interests may be targeted by filmmakers using social media groups, categories, and hashtags. Cost before. Independent filmmaking was constrained by the expensive expense of recording on film as opposed to digitally. Use of special effects raised the cost of making movies. Due to increased expenditures for movie actors and actresses, agency fees, escalating production costs, and advertising campaigns, movies in the 1990s became too costly to produce. Costs continued after. Since buying and processing film is more expensive than using a digital camera, the number of independent filmmakers has increased. One person can now operate modern cameras, reducing the number of team members required for a shot. Audiences can contribute to projects or campaigns on crowdfunding websites. Consumption before film became more appealing and brought in more money for producers when Nickelodeons or 5-cent movie theaters started to offer a simple, affordable option for the general public to see movies. The introduction of VHS and Laserdisc players in the 1970s led to a significant increase in studio earnings and income, but a decline in theater attendance. Consumption continued after. The income generated by electronic home video, which includes streaming services and on demand content, was anticipated to surpass that of American cinema by 2018. Viewers may access insider knowledge and behind the scenes views on their phones while viewing movies via second screen apps. Modern speakers that give the audience the impression that they're in the movie have improved in theater experiences.
Though films are a relatively new technology in comparison to other communication technologies dating back to just the late 19th century, films have proven to be a factor of shaping and reflecting cultures. Film allows people to experience different cultures and tales while also sharing stories, raising awareness for different social issues, and spreading historical retellings. Film is a deeply powerful and beautiful form of communication technology that has deeply impacted modern society and future communication technologies, even in relation to shorter online film platforms such as YouTube or TikTok. Could you imagine what life would be like without movies and film?